On July 5, 1978, in San Diego, two 16-year-old boys were kneeling on the ground and praying. Robert Alton Harris, the first murderer executed in California since 1967, stood behind them and said, "Quit crying and die like men," and pulled the trigger. But this man was ultimately remembered not just for this double murder, but because, 14 years later, his execution day staged the most dramatic day in American death penalty history. Around May 1978, 25-year-old Harris, he had just been paroled and his wife had divorced him while he was imprisoned. So, penniless, he decided to rob a bank. He found his 18-year-old brother Daniel and told him to figure out how to get some guns. On July 2nd, in Visalia, California, Daniel climbed into a neighbor's yard and stole two guns. That same night they stole the guns, Harris took Daniel and drove south along the highway to San Diego. They spent 2 days in the rural area near Miramar Lake, where they bought ammunition and practiced shooting in empty places. On July 4th, after monitoring the bank's security, Harris decided to carry out their bank robbery plan on July 5th, but they only had one car, they needed another one for the getaway. On July 5th, in a supermarket parking lot in Mira Mesa, 16-year-old John Majewski had just gotten his driver's license. To celebrate, he and his best friend Michael Baker were planning to go fishing at Miramar Lake. At that moment, they were sitting in a green Ford eating cheeseburgers, intending to head out once they finished. However, Harris and Daniel, those two men preparing to rob a bank, had their eyes on the car. Harris held a gun and threatened John and Michael into driving to Miramar Lake, while Daniel followed in the other car. Harris explained to the boys that he just needed the car for a bank robbery, and nobody would get hurt. The two boys believed that cooperating was their only chance to survive, so they complied with Harris and drove to Lake Miramar. However, once they arrived, Harris immediately pointed the gun at John and Michael and ordered them to get down on their knees. According to what Harris later bragged about in prison, after the two boys knelt down, they started crying and praying. Then he said, "Quit crying and die like men," and fired several shots, killing them. Then, Harris and Daniel went back to his home in Mira Mesa and finished the cheeseburgers that John and Michael had left half-eaten. About an hour later, they robbed the San Diego Trust and Savings Bank branch in Mira Mesa, getting away with roughly $2,000. That bank was right across the street from the supermarket, separated by a single road, close enough to almost see where John and Michael had parked. Though the police hadn't arrived at the scene yet, a witness stepped forward. After Harris and his crew robbed the bank, this person followed them all the way back to their home. Then, the witness called the police. When the San Diego Police Department's dispatch center received the report, Officer Stephen Baker was in the duty room. He was a veteran officer at the department. After getting the robbery alert, he and his colleagues moved out together, following standard procedure to block off the streets and surround Harris's house. The arrest went without any incident. Both Harris and Daniel were taken into custody. But later, Stephen learned something that shattered him. Just hours before the bank robbery, Harris had shot and killed two boys at Miramar Lake. One of those victims was Michael, his son. And he, completely unaware, had personally arrested the man who killed his boy. Shortly thereafter, the San Diego County District Attorney's Office filed charges against Harris for auto theft, kidnapping, 2 counts of murder, and burglary, all felonies, while the U.S. Attorney's Office charged him with bank robbery. Harris pleaded guilty to the bank robbery and got 25 years. On March 6, 1979, the trial began at San Diego County Superior Court. The jury found him guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder and 2 counts of kidnapping. The judge sentenced him to death. Meanwhile, Daniel got 6 years for kidnapping. During the trial, the prosecution dug deeper into his past and uncovered another killing. The victim was James Wheeler. In 1975, 22-year-old Harris was living with his wife and his brother Kenneth in a trailer park in Imperial County. Harris had just lost his job, so he spent his days drinking with Kenneth. On the day of the case, both Harris and Kenneth were drunk, and in that state they went after their neighbor, Wheeler. For the next 6 hours, Harris and Kenneth subjected Wheeler to a prolonged beating. Harris doused him with flammable liquid and threatened to burn him alive in shearing his head. At first, Harris claimed they wanted to give Wheeler a lesson in how to fight. After his arrest, he initially confessed to the killing, saying Wheeler had threatened his wife. Then he changed his story, claiming Kenneth was the one who caused Wheeler's death, and that he lied to cover for his brother. But in court, Wheeler's wife and niece both testified that it was Harris who killed him, and that it was an attack without reason, without warning. By any normal sentencing standard, this case showed Harris's extreme disregard for human life. A 6-hour beating with humiliation, threats of burning alive, and ultimately killed Wheeler. He should have gotten at least second-degree murder, but in the end, he was only convicted of voluntary manslaughter, and he was paroled after serving 3 years, given another chance to kill. From sentencing to execution, Harris spent 13 years on death row. During those 13 years, his legal team filed one appeal after another. Their core argument was that Harris shouldn't be sentenced to death because of his childhood trauma and mental developmental disorders, plus the controversy over the execution method. At the time, Harris was sentenced to die in the gas chamber, and the gas chamber had been deemed cruel and unusual punishment. The childhood trauma was that his father, Kenneth, was a U.S. Army sergeant who drank all day and regularly beat his wife and children. His mother, Evelyn, also drank, using alcohol to numb her own pain. Harris's very birth was a product of violence. On January 15, 1953, he was born at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, but it was not a natural birth. He was born 2 months premature as a result of Kenneth kicking Evelyn in the abdomen, and because Evelyn drank throughout her pregnancy, he developed fetal alcohol syndrome before he even entered the world. Because of this, Harris as a child often drifted into daydreams, talking to imaginary friends. At the same time, he was the primary target of his father's physical abuse, because Kenneth was convinced Harris was the product of Evelyn's affair. When Harris was 80 months old, Kenneth beat him with a bamboo cane, even held a gun to his head and threatened him. And Kenneth didn't just abuse Harris. In December 1962, when Harris's older sister Barbara was held in juvenile detention for theft, she revealed a long-hidden secret to the authorities. Their father had been sexually abusing her and her sisters. Living in a family like this, Harris entered law enforcement records at age 10, suspected of killing a cat. At 12, he started huffing glue, a cheap and easily accessible narcotic. At 13, he was locked up for 4 months in Santa Rosa Juvenile Hall for stealing a car, where he was repeatedly raped by other detainees. At 14, he was abandoned by his mother and 4 other siblings without even knowing it. Then, he moved to Oklahoma to live with his sister Barbara and brother Daniel. Despite suffering their father's sexual abuse, Barbara was still trying to make something of her life. When Harris moved in, she arranged for him to continue his education at a local school. But Harris was expelled shortly after enrolling, and within months he had developed a drug addiction. Barbara tried to stop him, but Harris resisted fiercely and chose to run away from home. By this point, Harris had basically received no education whatsoever, neither at home nor at school. He couldn't understand what his sister was doing, and couldn't accept her goodwill. After running away, Harris stole a car and was arrested in Florida. Over the next 4 years, he bounced between different reformatories. During this time, he attempted suicide multiple times and was diagnosed with schizophrenia. By the time he walked out of the reformatory at 19, he was a young man who had been discarded by one system after another: family, school, juvenile justice. It was precisely because of these experiences that Harris's case became endlessly controversial. Before the execution, Harris submitted a clemency request to then California Governor Pete Wilson, who had been mayor of San Diego at the time of the killings. The request was rejected during a live television news conference where Wilson read a statement acknowledging Harris's abusive childhood, but ended with a clear rejection. Wilson said, "As great as is my compassion for Robert Harris the child, I cannot excuse or forgive the choice made by Robert Harris the man." In 1981, the California Supreme Court upheld Harris's death sentence. The following year, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit overturned it. In 1984, the Supreme Court of the United States reversed the Ninth Circuit's decision and sent Harris back to death row. After that, his execution became mired in even greater controversy. In 1990, federal appeals court judge John Noonan Jr. issued a stay of execution in response to Harris's argument that childhood brain damage interfered with his judgment during his crimes. On April 18, 1992, 3 days before Harris's scheduled execution, U.S. District Judge Marilyn Patel issued a temporary restraining order regarding the constitutionality of the gas chamber. At 3:49 a.m. on April 21, 1992, Harris was escorted into the gas chamber. However, seconds before the execution was to begin, Judge Harry Pregerson of the Ninth Circuit stayed the execution for the 4th time, explaining that Harris should be allowed to file a new lawsuit in state court. 2 hours later, the Supreme Court of the United States vacated that stay, and in its ruling, explicitly ordering that no further stays of Robert Alton Harris' execution shall be entered by the federal courts except upon order of this court. So, at 6:01 a.m., Harris was escorted back into the gas chamber. Inside, he looked toward the witness gallery and saw Stephen, the father of the boy he had killed, the police officer who had arrested him 14 years ago without knowing who he was. He mouthed, "It's all right, and I'm sorry," to Stephen, then turned his head away, and Stephen, the older man, nodded in response, not out of forgiveness, just acknowledgement. Then Harris spoke those final words that would be quoted over and over. "You can be a king or a street sweeper, but everybody dances with the Grim Reaper." At 6:07, the execution order was given. 14 minutes later, he was pronounced dead. Later, Harris' name written repeatedly into court filings and news reports. But he is not the only name in this story worth remembering. James Wheeler, John Maskey, Michael Baker, and Stephen Baker, the man who unknowingly arrested the killer of his own son.